Community policing, what does that look like? Where, when you have some police officers who maybe don't reflect what the rest of their community looks like, or tell me how you get that engagement to happen.
Absolutely. And so my research specifically into this, and what I am actually learning from my research, and I talked about this 8 to 10 months ago, was what the component is being left out is the public perception. And that perception related to the law enforcement agencies that are actually policing or enforcing the laws in those communities, the perceptions of the public is what counts. If they do not feel that the police department is empathetic and or the police department is not showing those empathetic signals to the public, then this creates what I call hardening of communities, which means basically in essence that people shut down and you get this divisive measurement between the community and law enforcement, that us versus them perspective. So to me, empathy, which is a trait that's internalized, is a key component. But in a bigger framework, one of the things that my research also comes back to is the leadership. And that's all the way from the top and throughout law enforcement organizations. Who are the leaders that are out there actively working with those law enforcement officers on the front line? How does that leadership hold those officers accountable? This whole movement about Black Lives Matter is not a negative knock on law enforcement. It is more of asking law enforcement to hold those bad actors accountable. And from a law enforcement perspective, they want the citizens to also hold the bad actors within the community accountable. So it's this bi-directional relationship that's being polarized by people voices that are not coming up with solutions, but rather just antagonizing the situation, making baseless statements not on fact. And what I mean by that is that people can easily draw the conclusion that it's a black or white issue. This is a community citizen issue. And so growing up in a community that was East St. Louis, which was one of the highest crime rates at the time, which I'm very proud of, that made me want to get in law enforcement. That made me want to come back and work in those communities because I know that the citizens in those communities are good people. It's not every actor that's in the community, but people see the presence of law enforcement and some of the policing tactics, sometimes like hotspot policing, which occurs predominantly in structurally economic deprived communities. And so what does that look like from a citizen standpoint? So you have to step back out of your police hat and look at it from a citizen standpoint.
Well, do you think that sometimes law enforcement agencies can be a little tone deaf about how the public sees them?
Well, I think sometimes that we can, as law enforcement officers, can be overly sensitive to criticism, constructive criticism. And part of that is because right now it is the perception of law enforcement that they are not being supported as they would like to be, or they feel they need to be, because law enforcement officers are putting their lives on the line every day. And so they deserve that public support. But at the same time, one of the things that the public is demanding right now from law enforcement is that you have to hold the bad actors accountable, and not only hold them accountable, you got to call them out. You got to call them out. And when there's bad police officers that are inside organizations or working within organizations, the public want those officers to be identified and removed from the system. And so I think that is part of the rub in this. One of the things that I'm looking at is something called moral disengagement. And basically what that means is that you have individuals that are law enforcement officers that may work in communities, particularly in communities, and have perceptions of those communities, preceding perceptions. And so part of that is to teach officers how to actually diminish those perceptions. And basically it comes to be a bias sometimes. And these biases are not always even known to the officers until you get into a situation that may turn violent. And then it precedes itself or shows itself and in a costly situation. That's not always the case, but sometimes that's the case. And training is just not enough. You also need education. Research shows that higher educated officers use much less force than those without. And part of that is the diversity that they go through by going to college, the discipline of going to school, and the interaction between multicultural students helps better educate those individuals going into the job. So they may come in with perceptions about certain people, and they leave out of college with a much more in-depth perspective related to those individuals.
Well, are there some people, maybe you talked about bad actors, maybe they're just not suited for the job. Maybe there's just some personality. Should there be personality testing for police officers? Should there be psychological exams that are given to potential police officers as part of their employment?
Well, I can tell you this from the practitioner side. The actual background investigation preceding hiring of any cadet or any candidate for police is crucial, which is one of the reasons I dabbed into scholarly work and looking at training and police academy training related to this. That is a crucial moment in law enforcement. When you start looking at people that's going to be out there interacting in the communities, I don't necessarily, there's no evidence to the fact that it is a black or white issue and white officers can't work in predominantly black community. There's no linkage to show evidence that that is a problem. What does show and persists to show that it's a problem is those individuals that are actually working in a profession that have negative perceptions of certain communities and or that may be drawing on opinions of others about certain people in those communities, which also raises fear factors. And so with that being said, it then causes a problem when you have someone that interacts or see a person through a different lens. If they are a different race or ethnic group, or even sex for that matter, how they treat that person, how they interact, which once again goes back and ties into the whole empathy thing. If we dehumanize people, and especially in poor socially structured communities, and we dehumanize them, we don't have empathy for those individuals. And empathy is not the same as sympathy. People are not looking for sympathy. Empathy is just being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and seeing things from their viewpoint. That doesn't mean you have to sympathize. It doesn't mean that you're giving them the permission to commit crimes or acts. What that's saying is that you understand that this individual or this community may not have the same social structural system in which other communities have. And so you have to learn how to work within that framework, and identifying the officers that can do that is crucial.
Okay. Now, I'm going to have you finish your thought. You said if we dehumanize people in a poor social structure,
if we dehumanize people in poor social structures, then that means that this part of this Black Lives Matter movement, it is identifying or is looking at whether or not that is a cause, in some cases, for some of the use of force issues so rapidly because of this dehumanization that may be taking place. And that's only if that's happening. There's no evidence to say that, but from a citizen standpoint, that's the way they perceive it. That's the way they perceive it.
And there was both of the police officers that I talked to mentioned the role of social media in this, how it's so instant and everybody's got a camera and everybody's, do you think that people do sort of see these short bursts of video, 8 seconds, and somebody is actually shot in front of you, and make a judgment, and that judgment is concrete, and they move on to the next thing, and it affects their perception from that point forward?
I absolutely believe that the social media aspect definitely draws on the perceptions and becomes reality for many people. And I think that is one of the biggest things that law enforcement is faced with, is that they're not given the benefit of the doubt. It is this rapid judgment immediately that every time they use force, that there's something negative, or the officer did something negative to actually cause this to happen. I think this is a part that may be playing a role also and is missing. There's an educational component to all of this. And one of those things is that from both sides, bidirectional, for law enforcement and for the community, I think, is an educational component. One is how do we police today in 2016 with the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment, the Constitution, with the right to bear arms, and allowing citizens to carry weapons, and those citizens that are carrying weapons, when law enforcement interacts with them, how do those law enforcement officers see those individuals? They look through two different lenses at people. I mean, the way that I would be perceived carrying a gun may not be the way that you would be perceived as carrying a gun. And so how do we actually educate the public? When you talk about social media, how do we educate the public on saying, look, when you interact with a police officer, whether it be through a traffic stop, whether it be through a public contact, one, listen to what they're instructing you to do for your own safety, okay, at all times. And basically live to fight if it's something illegal going on another day, opposed to reaching for a cell phone or becoming combative and actually debating that with that officer. Because the bottom line is this: you want to live to prove that your rights were actually violated, opposed to taking a risk at reaching for a cell phone just to get an 8-second clip out there showing that, look, I'm being harassed. So that becomes crucial. That becomes a lesson for both parties. And understanding that today, the way the laws are structured with the right to carry, law enforcement officers are probably going to come in contact a lot more with citizens with firearms, whether albeit illegal or legal. And for those socially structural communities that are impoverished and those people who are out there carrying guns illegally, more times than not, they're not carrying the guns against law enforcement officers. They're carrying the guns either for the protection of themselves or the protection of whatever it is that they are out there doing in that community. So it's more or less the protection for them opposed to the threat. Over the course of this last few days, we've had over 14 law enforcement officers shot throughout the country. And those bad actors that are out there shooting law enforcement officers thinking that is actually going to change anything, or they think they're evening the scale somehow, that's actually fracturing this even more. Because now the face that is actually perceived as hurting law enforcement officers are those of young black males. And so that puts a negative connotation on it. And it also hurts the struggle of those individuals out there trying to affect change, like people that are organizers of Black Lives Matter and these other groups that are working closely with law enforcement to actually get justice for people when law enforcement officers commit egregious acts. So I think that needs to be something that is also addressed, that these bad actors in communities that think by going out hurting law enforcement officers is somehow evening the scales. It's understandable, the anger and the frustration by these things, but like you said, an 8 to 12 second clip of a video does not show the entire situation of a case. It doesn't mean that there's nothing to it. It just doesn't show everything. And I think we need to actually try to educate the public on at least pausing for a second and let's try to get to the bottom of it. But it makes it very tough to do that when you've been working in a system that people feel isn't fair. And it hasn't been fair. So you lose a lot of credibility.